A man and his old employer waited on a lonely bridge on a cloudy night. The tension in the air was high in the man's. His voice wavered as he spoke, and then a scream broke the stillness, followed by a thunderous splash, little realizing that beneath the darkness were two devoted. This devoted German shepherd's eyes have witnessed everything. So how could his quiet presence dismantle everything? The bridge towered across the river, its corroded railings groaning with the passage of time. Disregard the moon, which is obscured by dense, menacing clouds and hardly illuminated enough to. In the eerie silence of the night, Daniel paced uneasily, his footfall illuminating the landscape. Echoing on the metal planks, he looked over his shoulder while holding the ancient briefcase. Display of reluctance and remorse behind him, his senior supervisor, Mr. Whitmore, crept closer, his cane thumping methodically on the floor. Whitmore, with his silver hair, was a man of calm dignity. Despite the chilly wind circling his fragile body, he combed his hair back carefully, borne the burden of decades of dedication and hard work. Yet tonight he appeared unaware of the threat that was only a few feet away. He gazed at Daniel Whitmore with the type of trust that could only be developed through years of mentoring. "You've been like a son to me. I don't know," he whispered softly, his voice barely heard above the gentle rush of the river below. "I understand your concerns, but we can resolve them together." Daniel didn't reply, so his hold tightened around the briefcase while the temptation of the contents of a signed deed and an envelope of cash raced through his imagination. It was impossible to resist Whitmore's offer to transfer his profitable company. Had placed all of their trust in Daniel without realizing the escalating animosity and avarice brewing in the younger man's. Daniel's heart thumped more loudly as Whitmore leaned against the railing to recover his breath, and he remembered his. He needed this because of his growing debt, his failing investments, and the life he had always wanted but never achieved. Declared to himself that he deserved this, and then the treacherous moment arrived. A quick shove. Whitmore's cane clattered to the ground as his body screamed and gasped. Daniel froze, his breath catching as the splash sank into the freezing depths below. His heart pounded in his ears as it reverberated into the night. Yet his respite from the shadows of a slight rustle in the surrounding bushes interrupted the quiet, which Toby was unaware of. Whitmore's devoted German shepherd had been observing the whole event. As he moved forward with his body towel and shaky Daniel, his amber eyes shone with an almost human fervor. Toby's breath seized when he saw the dog too late and turned to face the man who had deceived his master. Daniel briefly thought about running the dog away, but there was something unsettling about Toby's presence. Toby didn't bark despite the silent, watchful stillness that made him shiver. Instead of growling, he just stood there looking, and then he seemed to understand Given the seriousness of the situation, he turned and ran into the shadows where Daniel was standing. As Toby's receding paws faded into the distance, he was frozen on the bridge, his thoughts racing with fear and bewildered. He repeatedly reenacted the push, scream, splash, and now the surprising sight of a dog. Believed to be merely a dog. But why did the experience seem so unsettling so fast? He grabbed up trembling hands and burst out of his reverie, unable to remain here. He threw Whitmore's cane over the bridge's edge and watched as it vanished into the river below. He took a deep breath, wiped the perspiration off his brow, and turned on his car's engine. Even though his plan wasn't ideal, he had to follow it since without the elderly guy at Whitmore's enormous estate be observed quickly, Daniel had to assume the role of the worried worker. Devastated by his mentor's abrupt absence, the massive mansion appeared as he pulled in the driveway. Unnaturally silent, typically Whitmore's voice would reverberate through the corridors, demanding. Even though Toby was instructing the crew, the home felt deserted tonight, as if Daniel, who was grieving for its owner, walked inside and practiced his lines. "I went looking for Mr. Whitmore," he said to himself. "I couldn't locate him when he claimed to want some fresh air." But as soon as he stepped inside the study, a deep growl stopped him in his tracks. Toby, the dog, was resting by the hearth with his coat wet from. His eyes shone with a mix of melancholy and rage as he fixed his sight on the rein that clung to his strong form. Daniel's spine tingled at the sight. "Toby," Daniel said. He squatted a little to seem less intimidating, his voice shaking, and he said, "Good kid, it's okay." But instead of moving, barking, or gritting his teeth, Toby just sat there. His stiff posture and unwavering gaze on Daniel gave the impression that he was quietly. Daniel felt uneasy as he accused the man of his crime. Animals didn't behave this way, did they? Was Toby attempting to get over his uneasiness, or wasn't supposed to comprehend what had transpired on that bridge? The following morning, the staff was already chatting about Whitmore's when Daniel retreated from the room and shut the door. Absence Daniel was believable in his part, his voice quivering as he described how Whitmore had left for. Police were contacted and a search team was formed after they went for a walk the previous evening and never came back. However, as the investigation progressed, Toby's behavior became more bizarre, and the dog followed Daniel. Daniel would hear Paw's gentle patting outside his room at night, while his amber eyes watched everything carefully. He couldn't sleep because of the deep growls that occasionally reverberated down the dim hallways, not only by his remorse, but also by the dog's eerie presence one night as Whitmore's hunt continued into. On the third day, Sarah Hayes, a detective, showed up at the estate. She was observant, quick-witted, and as she strolled through the mansion, she demonstrated her reputation for cracking even the most perplexing cases. Her eyes were pulled to Toby's gorgeous dog right away, and she knelt down to. Toby leaned into her touch and scratched behind his ears, his expression softening for the. Daniel forced a smile and continued. For the first time in days, he's loyal. He was Mr. Whitmore's delight and pride. Sarah took a minute to examine the puppy, her brow furrowing. Half jokingly, she said, "Loyalty like this often means they know more than we do." However, the remark really got at Daniel. And as the days stretched into weeks and there was no sign of Whitmore, authorities started to suspect foul play, and Sarah's attention focused on those closest to him, especially. Meanwhile, Daniel Toby became more irritated and would yell at the door whenever Daniel attempted to exit and growl deep and low anytime he came near Whitmore's possessions. Daniel was sitting by himself in the study at night when he heard a curious noise, a gentle scratching at the glass. His heart raced when he turned to see Toby looking at him through the glass, his eyes gleaming in the. It seemed as though the dog was taunting him to confess in the moonlight. Daniel felt he had to get rid of Toby since he was unable to concentrate with the dog and could no longer handle the pressure, persistently reminding him of what he had done late one evening when he put Toby in his car and drove far away. When they arrived to a remote control, the dog was sitting quietly in the passenger seat, staring at Daniel. Daniel cleared the way, opened the door, and motioned for Toby to exit. Toby paused, his eyes probing, and he replied, "You'll be fine out here." Daniel's face before turning and vanishing into the trees with a little whimper. Daniel was pleased to leave the dog's accusing presence behind as he drove away, but profound. As Daniel drove away, the woods were unnaturally quiet, and he knew he hadn't seen Toby last. For the first time in days, he felt a faint light cut through the blackness like a sword. Feeling of satisfaction that Toby was no longer living or thinking about the dog. He believed that he could now begin to restore control, yet deep down, The following morning, Goring's uneasiness persisted like an ember that would not go out. When Daniel heard a loud knock on his front door, his heart leaped in his chest, and panic broke out. Even worse, what if someone had discovered Whitmore? His thoughts were racing through the worst-case scenarios. Seeing him at the bridge, he forced the idea out of his head, gathered himself, and opened the door to discover. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway." Sarah. Detective Sarah Hayes is standing on the porch. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I have," she murmured, her keen eyes sweeping over his face. Some developments about Mr. Whitmore's case. Daniel made an effort to smile politely despite his sticky palms. When Sarah entered the house, it appeared that she was going to absorb all the information, her eyes resting on the subtle scuffs on the hardwood floors close to the study, where, when Toby used to sit, she didn't say anything, but Daniel saw her look and moved. Sarah seated herself in the living room and explained, uncomfortably, "We've expanded our search radius. However, I wanted to discuss something uncommon with you regarding Toby." Daniel asked Toby, pretending to be perplexed, and Sarah nodded, drawing him in. a folder from her backpack, and we discovered him. Or rather, he discovered us this morning. Deputies said that he was sitting at the door barking until someone let him in when he arrived at the local sheriff's office. Daniel found it difficult to maintain his neutral demeanor as Sarah, and his blood flowed cold. The odd aspect, she added, was that opening the folder within was a picture of Toby sitting in the sheriff's office, holding a cane in his mouth, seemed familiar. Cain Whitmore's cane as Sarah set the cane down. Daniel's heart raced in his chest. "We're having the photo on the coffee table examined for prints," she remarked, her tone casual, but her piercing eyes could reveal what transpired that evening while Daniel gazed at the picture. My thoughts were racing about how Toby had returned and why he had carried the cane. For the first time, he started to question whether Toby's acts were more than just the result of instinct or something more intentional. "Strange actions of a devoted dog," Daniel remarked, his voice hardly steady. Sarah responded, reclining back in her chair. "I thought Toby had fled after Mr. Whitmore disappeared, but apparently not." The remainder of the chat went rather quickly, and Sarah asked a few more questions. Animals have a way of surprising us, don't they? Inquiries concerning Whitmore's routines and their connection, but Daniel was unable to concentrate because his mind was racing. Considering the consequences of Toby's return, he fell onto the couch with his head in his hands. But later that night, Daniel's respite was brief as he paced the home in an attempt to recall his. He was about to move when he heard a low, continuous growl outside and froze. Slowly tensing every muscle in his body, he walked to the window and looked out. Toby's first stood in the porch light's glow, standing in the darkness. His amber eyes seemed to flare with such intensity that Daniel's blood ran cold as they glistened in the damp air. Daniel retreated from the dog, who only looked as though waiting without barking or moving. His breath was coming in quick, weak, low gasps through the window. This couldn't be true. How could he find his way back so fast after leaving Toby miles away in the woods? And why did Daniel feel as though the dog was attempting to communicate with him? In a desperate moment, he reached for his phone. "I contacted Sarah Detective Hayes, who said in a trembling voice, 'I believe you should. Return to Toby. He's here.'" Sarah showed up within an hour with an animal control officer. Toby was still sitting calmly on the porch as though he had been. Sarah leaned down, intently examining the dog, anticipating their arrival, but Toby doesn't seem hostile, she remarked, looking at Daniel, who was undoubtedly attempting to convey something to the animal control. When they were ready to depart, the officer came forward, gently leashing Toby and guiding him to the truck. Started barking violently while tugging at the leash and turned to face the house. "What is it, boy?" Sarah said. The dog's behavior became more frenzied as he followed Toby's gaze, whining and scratching at the ground. When Sarah signaled to the police to release Toby, the dog ran toward the backyard, nose down, as Daniel determinedly sniffed and stared in helplessness as Toby guided them to a disturbed dirt patch close to the garden. Sarah mumbled, "This doesn't look right," and knelt down to start digging. The loose dirt gave way quickly. Shortly after, she discovered something that stopped Daniel's heart. A tiny object covered in muck appeared, a gold watch. And it wasn't just any watch. It was a recognizable Whitmore's with it. Sarah's brows furrowed as she examined the mud-stained watch under the etched letters. The faintly glowing etched initials JW in her flashlight beam confirmed. She glanced at Daniel, who had a pale face and quivering hands by his sides. "This is Mr. Whitmore's, isn't it?" Sarah asked in a steady yet inquisitive tone, and Daniel stumbled as he looked for a believable justification. "I'm not sure if he dropped it before he." Sarah didn't respond right away. Instead, she watched Daniel. Toby, who was now sitting quietly at her side, seemed to notice nothing that her keen eyes were missing. Reflect her intensity, his unblinking eyes were fixed on Daniel, who was observing Sarah with fascination. Lastly, he stated, "We'll need to run some tests to see if there's anything useful before placing the watch in an evidence bag. Fingerprints, soil composition, and possibly even DNA." Daniel's chest constricted with each. Cried out for him to run, but he knew that would just make him appear more guilty, so he had to continue playing. Naturally, he said this while feigning to be the cooperative and worried employee. "Anything to help find Mr. Whitmore," Sarah replied, but she forced a faint grin. There was a noticeable lack of trust. "Thank you for your cooperation, Daniel. We'll be in." Toby halted as she and the animal control officer were about to depart. He gave Daniel one more glance, and something that seemed like both pity and accusation filled his amber eyes. Then, silently, he got into the truck, leaving Daniel alone with his growing fear that he wouldn't be able to sleep that night. Daniel felt as though the great estate's walls were closing in on him, strangling him with their quiet. He saw signs of Whitmore everywhere he looked, including the portrait hanging on the fireplace and his favorite chair. Examine even his cologne's subtle odor. But it wasn't just the house that was haunting him. Was Toby's mind constantly replaying the dog's penetrating glance, each one a silent judgment, and then he couldn't recall dropping the watch in the garden, but it was there. How did it end up there? Daniel poured himself a hard drink in an attempt to calm his nerves because he was in such a worry that anything may happen that night. He had to cover his traces, so he tried to plan his next move while the amber liquid burned its way down his throat. Eliminate any proof that may connect him to Whitmore's disappearance, believing that if Sarah discovered the watch. The notion sent a chill down his spine. What more could she find? Decided to get rid of any loose ends. So he took a flashlight and went outside. Under the dim moonlight, the garden was strangely silent. Daniel worked rapidly, raking the dirt close to When the watch was discovered, his hands were shaking as he crawled through the ground to look for anything that would implicate him. Deeper, he noticed an unexpected gleam of metal in his heart with his flashlight. He froze in terror when he unearthed the object, which turned out to be a cufflink, inscribed with the same letters as the watch, JWW. He felt a wave of panic. Had he been so irresponsible in his rush to hide his wrongdoing that he shoved the cufflink into his pocket? His thoughts were racing with possible explanations when he heard a noise. Caused him to halt as he heard a low, guttural growl and the gentle rustle of leaves behind him. He carefully turned his. Daniel's breath caught when he saw the flashlight beam piercing the darkness at the garden's edge. How could it be that the dog had been brought to the rehabilitation facility and his fur was still in his throat? His eyes were glowing with a furious intensity as he shimmered in the moonlight. Daniel trembled as he whispered, and Toby moved forward, moving steadily and deliberately without barking or snarl more. He only kept his eyes fixed on the dog as though it were. Daniel retreated with his heart racing, daring him to confess. "Stay back," he yelled, wielding the flashlight as a weapon. "You're a dog. You have no idea what you're doing yet." In the back of Daniel's mind, Toby's presence seemed almost supernatural, as if the dog's eyes appeared to pierce right through him as he stripped, as if he were an incarnation of Whitmore's lingering spirit. Daniel was unable to bear it any longer, so he took his lies away and revealed the truth. He turned and ran back inside the home, slamming the door behind him before collapsing onto his chest on the floor, heaving as he attempted to recover his breath. But the relief was brief because he was startled upright by a loud bang at the door. Hesitantly he opened it, his mind racing with mistrust and panic, only to discover Sarah standing there, looking grim, saying, "We need to talk," and stepping. Daniel swallowed hard within without waiting for an invitation, and his palms stung from perspiration. "Is something wrong, detective?" Sarah showed him a number of pictures on her phone, which she said were taken this evening at the sheriff's office. When Toby returned, he had a piece of ripped fabric in his mouth that appeared to have come from a jacket. Daniel's blood ran cold. "Possibly yours." And he opened his mouth to object, but no. Sarah spoke, her gaze piercing him with her keen intuition, sensing his. Daniel replied, "Is there something you're not telling me?" in a calm but forceful voice. Sarah's question lingered in my Daniel's thoughts like a tempest of panic. His natural tendency was to reject everything in order to maintain his innocence. But the growing evidence and Toby's unwavering acts demonstrated that the walls were closing in. Daniel finally murmured, "I don't know what you mean." Sarah exhaled, scarcely raising her voice above a whisper, her keen eyes following every move he made. "I've witnessed this before, Daniel. People believe they can conceal the truth, but it always comes out. You might not want to tell me right away, but Toby seems intent on speaking for you," Daniel flinched at what she said because she didn't comprehend how much it wounded. How could a dog appear to be so deliberate and determined to expose him? I'm not sure why Toby is acting this way, he continued, feigning a feeble laugh. Perhaps he's simply bewildered without Whitmore. Sarah cocked her head to study, as dogs don't comprehend things the same way humans do. Daniel, don't undervalue animals, especially those like Toby's loyalty. She gave him a farewell before leaving, but his doesn't fade easy. Warning, Toby and I are not finished yet. It seems that night Daniel walked his room, the ripped cloth, the cufflink, the weight of his guilt bearing down on him like a physical force. As he poured himself another drink, it seemed as though every error he had made that evening was coming back to punish him. Drink in an attempt to calm him down, but it didn't do much to block off the memories of the bridge. The splash of water and Whitmore's frantic sobs while he sat with his phone in the darkened room buzzed on the table. It was an unidentified number. He answered Daniel hesitantly. "Yes," said Calloway in a rough voice. "Who is this?" The voice on the other end laughed. Daniel's blood ran cold. "Let's assume, darkly, that I know things about you that you prefer to keep hidden. What are you?" Speaking of you believing that nobody witnessed what transpired that evening, the voice went on to suggest that Toby isn't the only one observing you. The line died before Daniel could reply, and he gazed at his hands were shaking when he called. Who was this person, and how could they have known what he had? And the next day, Daniel was met with yet another unpleasant revelation as he stepped. He discovered a little parcel on the porch when going outside to retrieve the mail. It was unsigned and had no return address. He carefully carried it inside, and when he opened it, he saw a tiny, muddy item, a gold ring with Whitmore's. Underneath, there was a note scrolled in sloppy handwriting with initials inscribed on the inside. "You can't hide the truth." As he gazed at the ring, Daniel's breath caught because it was yet another piece of evidence linking him to Whitmore's disappearance. But the messages implied that someone else was aware of it and was making fun of him now that it was in his house. He double-checked the locks on the windows and doors as his panic took over, his eyes darting to every shadow. And Toby should have felt relieved by movement outside of his absence, but instead he felt more vulnerable. Sarah proceeded with her inquiry in the meanwhile, assembling the pieces of evidence that appeared to. She went to the sheriff's office to examine the things Toby had brought since she was suspicious, and she pointed at Daniel, growing with every discovery, almost as if he's guiding us to the solutions. She said to the sheriff, The sheriff responded by tapping the most recent forensics team report that Toby supplied, saying that someone else is. Sarah nodded, confirming that it matches Daniel Calloway's jacket. Things are starting to come together. It's not enough to charge him yet, but it's coming close. Perhaps we'll need more. Should watch what Toby does next. The sheriff said that, without Sarah's knowledge, someone else was actually drawing A stranger in the shadows observed Daniel's every action. Their intentions were unclear, but they had witnessed what occurred on the bridge that evening. But they opted for a more private method of communication rather than approaching the authorities. Justice. It was this unidentified witness who had placed the ring on Daniel's porch to contact him in the middle of the night. And as they prepared to implement their next strategy that night, Daniel was taken aback by the sound of. He hurried to the kitchen after breaking glass and discovered a rock on the floor with several pieces stuck to it. Came another message saying, "You're running out of time." Panic gripped him, and he began to do. Was this the enigmatic caller Sarah? Or was Toby somehow involved? Although the dog's behavior was out of the usual, Daniel cleaned up the mess on his phone, buzzed once more, but this time it was a text message from an unknown sender. "Meet me at the bridge tonight, or I'll tell everyone what I know about the darkness," was the message. Was oppressive as Daniel drove his car slowly down the winding road toward the bridge, making the place feel even more dreadful as it had been the night he had pushed Whitmore over the edge. The recollection came back to him with the sound of the water splashing and the frantic screams that died away haunted clarity. Now, rather than his own guilt, the terrifying word from an official was pulling him back to the scene of his crime. He parked his car at the bridge's edge and went outside, his heart thumping so loudly that it drowned out the winds rustling through the trees. And the only sound in the strangely peaceful night was the faint croaking of. A lone figure appeared from the shadows, standing at the base of the frogs from the river below. Daniel tried to see their faces in the middle of the bridge, but they were obscured by the darkness. Who are you, Daniel? Commanded his voice, which was shaking even though he was trying to sound calm. The figure moved closer to their silhouette, wearing a hooded jacket and keeping their face buried in their palm. They were momentarily illuminated by the faint moonlight. They held a flashlight, which was little and made of metal, and they turned it on. The figure's voice added, "I'm aiming for Daniel's face, so you don't recognize me. Worked by a voice modulator. I guess that makes sense. You didn't want to pay too much attention that evening, did you?" Daniel asked, trying to hide the fact that his blood was freezing. "What do you want from me?" With a growing sense of dread in his voice, the figure said, "Say it out and tell me how you murdered Whitmore." Daniel gasped. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Absurd." The figure chuckled with a chilly, hollow sound. "And it's still lying today, letting Daniel down, but you're out of options." The stranger threw something on the ground at Daniel. Paused at his feet before stooping to retrieve it, his fingers shaking. "What was a USB drive?" he asked in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper, and the figure replied simply, "I witnessed what you did that evening, and if you don't come clean, everyone will see it." Even Daniel's knees. He gripped the drive tightly and pleaded, "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" Threatening to collapse, Daniel saw a young woman with piercings on her face for the first time as the figure moved closer. She had green eyes and appeared familiar, but he was unable to identify her. "You don't even remember me, do you?" she continued, her voice shaking with controlled rage. "My father was a Whitmore employee, and he was devoted, similar to that dog of his, but you destroyed his life when you took over by firing him." Before he could react, Daniel realized that Whitmore had been annihilated. The woman went on, "I'm not like you, Daniel, and I didn't come here to kill you, but I'll make sure you pay. I'll broadcast the footage tomorrow morning if you don't confess for what you did, and believe me, the cops won't." As the woman vanished into the darkness, Daniel stood motionless on the bridge, the only people pounding on your door. With his head racing and the weight of her words bearing down on him like a physical force, he staggered back to his car, allowed the film to be seen by the public. But what other options did he have? The walls were closing and his hands were shaking as he put the USB disk into his laptop as soon as he got home. The screen flickered to life as he opened the file, revealing grainy video of that fateful night. Unsteady, but enough clear to convey the entire dispute with Whitmore and the older man's desperate shove. He tried to hang on, but ultimately he fell into the freezing water beneath the damming. Daniel slammed the laptop shut, his breathing ragged, and the evidence was indisputable. Though his head was full of options, none of them provided a path out, so surrendering seemed like conceding defeat. But as Sarah was putting her life back together, the video would ruin what little he had left. Despite the growing evidence against Daniel, she needed more to make an arrest, so she went over the things Toby had taken: the cufflink, the ripped cloth, and the watch to the police. Provided a more detailed account of the events, but it was insufficient to establish a conviction. Her phone buzzed with an anonymous number texted, "The bridge midnight, don't be late." Daniel was startled awake the following morning by his phone's constant buzzing, so he reached for it with a. His heart fell when he opened one of the messages the video contained on his drowsy hand and saw a barrage of notifications. Been leaked, and it was visible on all social media platforms and news sites, including his email. He was overcome with panic when he realized how serious the situation was and that there was no way to hide it now that everyone knew what he had done, and the cops would eventually show up at his door when the morning sun's faint light fell over Daniel's property. But the normal calm was broken by the turmoil that was taking place inside Daniel as he sat hunched on. The video was all over his couch, his face buried in his hands, and now every major. His name appeared in headlines accusing him of murder while the news outlet carried the story, and his phone buzzed constantly with texts and calls. But he chose to ignore them all because he was still unable to face the outside world and the loud hammering on his. He was startled upright by the front door, and he paused, his breath catching as the knowledge hit. The police would eventually come for him, but as he looked out the window, he saw nothing. Instead of seeing uniformed officers, he noticed Sarah standing there with a mixture of resolve and, grudgingly, something he couldn't quite identify as pity. Daniel greeted her with a voice that I assumed was Hollow Z as he opened the door. "Detective, As you have seen in the film, Sarah entered without waiting for an invitation, saying simply, "And it doesn't look good for you, Daniel." He sank back in his chair, his shoulders drooping as she said. He inquired, his voice scarcely audible above a whisper, "What do you want from me?" "I want the truth," Sarah said, drawing up a chair. "That footage may have spilled across from him, but I need to hear it from you." For a brief moment, Daniel thought about denying everything that had transpired on the bridge that night, but he knew it was useless since the video was unquestionable and there was no way to avoid the reality at this point. He took a deep breath and started talking, saying that this wasn't how it was intended to happen. "Whitmore and I argued, and Daniel replied in a shaky voice that I was trying to. He claimed I was ungrateful, that I owed him money in order to take over the business and undermine him. Everything to him." "And did you press Sarah?" Daniel's jaw tensed. "Perhaps I was, but even after that, he treated me like some lackey and never considered me an equal. After years of working alongside him, I wanted to show him that I was worthy of his respect that evening. So," he paused, his eyes sparkling with unshed tears. "I only wanted him to back off, so he could see that I wasn't trying to harm him. I was terrified of him, but when he stumbled, I freaked out and didn't. You left him there to drown since you knew what to do," and Sarah carefully examined him. "When Daniel's head fell into his hands, I hoped someone would discover him in time, but I was too afraid to stay." Sarah looked out into the uncomfortable calm, broken by the hum of oncoming vehicles. She went back to Daniel, her expression unreadable, as she watched police cars arrive at the estate outside the window. She whispered, "They're here to take you in," over Daniela. Daniel didn't fight as the officers came inside. Sarah watched in silence as they read him his rights and cuffed him, his hands shaking. Reveal her feelings, a turbulent mixture of joy and grief that she had resolved. The case, but it had a price she didn't expect, just like Daniel's. As they were led to the police vehicle, a well-known person showed up at the driveway's edge. Toby stood there with his golden coat shining in the sunlight, his gaze fixed on Daniel. The dog didn't snarl or bark, just gazed at him. Sarah knelt next to Toby, a quiet testament to the justice and loyalty that had finally brought Daniel's life to an end. "Back at the station, Daniel," she whispered, "you did good, boy," with a hand running over his fur. Sat in the questioning room with a fog of sorrow and hopelessness that seeped into his thoughts. Although the video had sealed his doom, it also left him wondering who had taken it and why they had waited. It took so long to release it, but later that day, Sarah got a tip. An unnamed young woman had been sighted, according to an anonymous source. When Sarah looked further, she discovered a link between the bridge on the night of Whitmore's death and the woman was Emily Carter, the daughter of Whitmore's former employees. Emily, one of Whitmore's most devoted employees, was let go by Daniel during a period of company layoffs. Emily had been at the bridge that evening. Her phone recorded the incriminating video, but she chose not to give it to the police. She had decided right away to wait, using it as leverage to make sure. As the pieces came together and justice was done, Sarah couldn't get rid of the feeling that the story wasn't finished yet. Emily's involvement had given the case a new dimension that suggested a more complex web of motivations and outcomes. However, Daniel was currently in custody and the immediate threat had been eliminated. And Toby's position as a hero had been solidified by his part in revealing the truth. When Sarah got back to the station that evening, she saw Toby sleeping in his makeshift bed. She knelt next to him and put her hand on his head. "Thank you, Toby," she whispered quietly. Without you, this would have been feasible." Toby replied with a gentle tail wag, closed his eyes as he floated. Sarah felt a feeling of closure as she fell asleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. However, she was also aware that the case's repercussions would continue to touch lives in ways she was unable to yet. Sarah and the crew experienced a flurry of activity in the days after Daniel's arrest due to the media frenzy. As the situation around the leaked film worsened and the public demanded answers, Sarah's account was about the unseen links that had brought about this moment and the individuals whose life it was not just Daniel's crime, had become entangled in ways they could not have imagined in the recovery facility where Toby had. Sarah watched as the veterinarian completed the examination the dog had undergone after being taken for a standard checkup. So much seeing his owner die, relentlessly pursuing justice, and now being in the public eye. According to the veterinarian, who patted Toby on the head, he is in excellent health and is a local hero. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. Sarah watched Toby wag his tail and smiled, but her mind was elsewhere. Could not help but reflect on how he had contributed to the discovery of the truth. Without him, Daniel might not have been captured, but she couldn't help but wonder whether Toby's actions were motivated by a simple sense of loyalty to Whitmore, or was there a deeper factor at work? Later that day, Sarah got Emily Carter called. She had stayed out of the spotlight since the tape was exposed, but now she wanted to meet. After Sarah consented, they planned to meet at a peaceful cafe on the outskirts of town. When Sarah got there, she discovered Emily seated in a corner with her hands clenched around a hot cup of coffee. Appeared anxious, her eyes darting about the space as though she thought someone may know her. Emily, Sarah inquired. "Thank you for meeting me," the young woman said softly as she walked up to the table, nodding and tightening her hold on the cup. Remarked in a barely audible voice, "I'm glad you reached out," to which Sarah responded, sitting across from her. "I've been trying," she continued. Emily stopped, her eyes falling to the table. "I think you might have some answers to piece everything together," she added. "I didn't intend for things to get this far, so I just couldn't let him get away with it. Coming forward was the correct thing to do," Sarah told her, but Emily drew a trembling breath and said, "Why wait? Why not call the police right away? My dad used to say that Whitmore was a decent man, but when he was fired, it worried him, broke him, and after learning about what transpired on the bridge, I initially wasn't sure what to do, but when I saw Toby's actions and his determination made me understand that I needed to take action. Like I owed it to him," Emily disclosed as the discussion went on. She had learned more about her father's relationship with Whitmore and the sense of betrayal he had experienced following his dismissal. Growing up with tales of Whitmore's generosity and kindness, and witnessing Daniel's calculating and frigid behavior had stoked my drive for justice, and that evening, Emily acknowledged her. "I followed Daniel. I didn't mean to tremble, but I knew something wasn't right when I saw him and Whitmore arguing, so I ducked behind the woods and began to record on my phone, but I paused when Whitmore dropped." Sarah, unsure of what to do, listened carefully, her admiration for the young woman building with each statement about Emily's courage. "What do you do now?" Recording the video and eventually coming forward had been essential to solving the case. As their chat came to an end, Sarah inquired, "I don't know." Emily shrugged, her eyes sparkling with unshed tears. "I sincerely hope that Whitmore's family finds some peace as a result of this. And Toby deserves that much." In the meantime, the sheriff went over the evidence one final time at the station before sending it in. The evidence against Daniel was solid when it reached the prosecutor's office because of the joint efforts of Sarah, Toby, and Emily. He couldn't get rid of the feeling that there was more to find out. So he called Sarah as he wrote the final report. She entered his office, waited a moment, nodded, and sat down. "We have." Daniel claimed that the evidence was strong, but the issue of Whitmore's will remains. "Were you aware that he had?" Sarah scowled. "No, I didn't see why the sheriff gave her a." According to the paper, Whitmore left Toby nearly everything, including his estate and savings that even the business shares, all of which are under the supervision of an animal welfare. Daniel learned about the organization a week prior to Whitmore's passing. Daniel's motivation for killing Whitmore had just become crystal clear, and the revelation struck Sarah like a lightning strike. Had been motivated by money, not only rage or power. Whitmore's choice to bequeath his inheritance to Toby had been. Daniel couldn't stand the last insult that night, so Sarah went to She returned to the rehabilitation facility and sat down next to Toby, who was contentedly gnawing on a bone in his cage. "You truly are something special," she replied, marveling at the case's many twists and turns. "Few individuals could do what you've done," Toby said, scratching behind his ears while waving his tail and shining his eyes. Sarah experienced a sense of closure at that point, because the case wasn't only. It was about respecting the relationship between a man and his dog, and the loyalty that had finally led to the resolution of a crime. Revealed the reality while Daniel sat by himself in his detention cell. The burden of the wall seemed to be closing in the silence as his actions weighed down on him like an unstoppable torrent. He had once been a man of integrity, only occasionally disturbed by the distant sound of keys jangling or cops passing by. Power, fortune, and influence, but now he was just a prisoner waiting for his. In the meantime, Sarah was assembling the last pieces of the case at the police station alongside. Now that they had Whitmore's will and Emily's testimony was formally documented, the story was finished. But Sarah understood that this was about justice for Whitmore, Toby, and all the lives involved, not just about solving a crime. Late that night, Sarah was back at the scene of Daniel's greed. While reviewing the evidence one more time, she produced a picture of Whitmore and Toby that had been shot only a few weeks prior. Prior to his passing, the dog's devoted stare and the elderly man's kind grin stood in sharp contrast to the cold, calculated. The look Daniel had on his face in his photograph served as a reminder of the seriousness of the situation. Her thoughts were cut short by a Sheriff Sarah called and said, "We have a situation." His tone was frantic. Must ascend to the holding room. When Sarah got there, she discovered mayhem. Daniel was pacing his cell while yelling, "You don't understand what I did," at the top of his lungs. The officers tried to calm him down, but Sarah intervened by speaking firmly enough to make him pay the money he deserved. Daniel stopped as she said, "You've already confessed. What are you trying to accomplish?" He paced and looked at her, his eyes crazed. "You think you understand everything, don't you?" He spat, "But you don't. The entire narrative. Then explain to me what I'm missing for Sarah's crossing of her arms." Daniel paused for a while, his face vacillating between desperation and rage. He then started talking in a low, tremulous voice, and it became clear that he wasn't the man. Everyone believed he was Daniel, who remarked that although he was nice to Toby, he was cruel to everyone else. Sarah frowned that he didn't care about the business or the employees. All that mattered to him was his legacy. Doesn't excuse your actions. Killing him didn't make everything better. Daniel shook his head, his hands clutching the. "You don't understand that he humiliated me by making sure I would never be able to. The last insult was that he treated me like I was his equal before abandoning everything to that dog. Worthless, as if I didn't matter." And his voice broke. Sarah saw I didn't mean to murder him," Daniel muttered, showing a moment of weakness beneath his haughtiness. She only wanted to make. As Daniel's confession reverberated throughout the little space, Sarah experienced a pang of sympathy for the guy in front of her. Didn't alter the reality that Whitmore had passed away and that Daniel's actions had started a chain of events that could. No matter what your motivations were, they don't justify what you did. Did Sarah say emphatically that you had to face the repercussions of your decision back at the recovery center? Despite his success in adjusting to his new environment at the facility, Toby was starting to exhibit signs of restlessness. The staff observed his conduct and ascribed it to the residual effects of the uneasiness in the air of the case. But Sarah noticed something more profound when she went back to see how he was doing. Sarah, who was sitting by Toby's cage, said softly to the dog, "You've accomplished so much." She stated that already, but I believe you still have more to tell us, don't you? Toby's ears perked up. As his perceptive gaze met hers, he softly barked, seemingly in consensus. It served as a reminder of the connection that had motivated him to learn the truth, a connection that Sarah was committed to. Honor. Emily showed up at the station the following morning to deliver a last piece of proof, Whitmore's journal, which she had discovered the journal, which had thorough details on her father's life, while organizing his old possessions, goals for the business, his growing suspicion of Daniel, and his love for Toby. Daniel's ambition is perilous. According to an entry made just days before he passed away, that I have to safeguard Toby and make sure he doesn't go to great lengths to gain power, even if it means harming innocent people. The notebook was a damning piece of evidence that confirmed Daniel's motivation in painting. Thus, the company's future is still assured. A detailed account of what transpired before the murder, which for Sarah was the last. Later that day, as Sarah was in the courtroom observing Daniel's arraignment, she experienced a range of feelings, including relief that justice was being done, hope for Toby, and sorrow for Whitmore and his life that was cut short, whose allegiance had exposed the truth, and Sarah saw Daniel being taken away in handcuffs. With her hands gripped securely in her lap, Emily sat in the gallery. Their eyes locked, and Emily nodded silently. Because of the path they had traveled together, the courtroom was tense as Daniel's trial went forward. Confession, the video that was leaked, and now Whitmore's journal, which depicted treachery and ambition gone deadly. However, when the jury pondered more, there was a sense of expectation. As sat in the gallery next to Emily and Whitmore's distant relatives, the absence of Toby felt like an endless burden. However, his involvement in the case was significant since the prosecutor had utilized his allegiance and deeds as a representation of justice and truth, a manifestation of the connection between humans and animals, as the prosecution had contended. In addition to witnessing the incident, Toby made sure the truth was revealed. That allegiance has no monetary value, and as the trial went on, the courtroom was tense. Daniel's confession, the video that was leaked, and now Whitmore's journal, which depicted treachery and ambition gone deadly. However, there was a sense of excitement as the jury considered Sarah's case. The wait felt unending in the gallery next to Emily and Whitmore's distant relatives since Toby wasn't there. However, his involvement in the case was significant. The prosecutor had exploited his allegiance and acts as a representation of truth and justice and the unity of humanity. An animal. As the prosecution had maintained, Toby did not merely observe the offense, he made sure the truth was revealed, which is a dedication that cannot be valued, and the jury came back to deliver the verdict. The courtroom went quiet, and Daniel sat motionless, his face impassive. The foreigner stood clearing her throat, but his fingers trembled uncomfortably, and then he said the words that everyone had been anticipating that the jury would convict defendant Daniel Carter of. Whispers followed the second-degree murder gasps that reverberated throughout the room. In murmurs, Daniel's face sagged, his poise finally evaporating. It was a bittersweet time for him to be sitting next to Sarah. Justice had been done, but the price was indisputable following. Sarah left the courthouse after the decision, enjoying the fresh air as a pleasant break from. She discovered Emily standing close to the stairs, gazing at the horizon, which was above her in the stuffy interior. Sarah's voice was hardly audible at the moment, but she answered, "Sir, but you know as well. There is still work to be done. So as I go, this case will cause repercussions." Emily's curiosity flickered. What sort of work, in her opinion, did Whitmore's journal allude to that went beyond Danielle? Betrayal. Sarah clarified that the company has a vast network of corruption. Those who ignored or condoned Daniel's acts must be held accountable if we are to achieve true justice. In the meantime, Toby was getting used to his new life at the rehabilitation facility. Although the staff had gone all of their way to make him feel at home, his relationship with Sarah was indisputable, and he frequently perked up at the sound of her voice. And on this specific day, when she came to visit, his tail waggled with unbridled delight. As Toby ran over to Sarah, she said, "I thought it was time you met the real hero of this story." Sarah had brought Emily along. Emily leaned down to greet them, her eyes brimming with emotions as she scratched behind Toby's ears. "You're amazing, Emily." Toby licked her palm and gave her a wordless look, knowing that she muttered, "You're the reason we're here today." As the day went on, Sarah and Emily talked about the next steps in Sarah's investment strategy. Although the corruption at Whitmore's was ambitious, it was essential if we wanted. Sarah stated that we must eradicate the rot in order to honor Whitmore's legacy, which entails holding everyone responsible, not just Daniel. Emily paused as she traced the border of a picture she owned. "I'll assist her." Presented a photo of Whitmore and her father standing with pride in front of the company's headquarters. Claimed that at last, "My father had faith in Whitmore's vision and that I would stop at nothing to safeguard it." The case against Daniel may be over, but Sarah went back to her office that evening to gather her findings. She had a gut feeling that there was more to discover because Whitmore's journal included mysterious allusions to meetings and transactions. Things didn't add up, so Sarah opened her laptop and started searching since she was determined to follow the trail. Her mind was buzzing with potential as she went through files, but as she worked, an email from an unidentified source appeared on her screen with the subject line, "There's more you need." When Sarah clicked on the linked email, her heart skipped a beat. Document that lists the dates of a number of transactions between Whitmore's company and a shell corporation. Up with the Danielle betrayal timeframe, but the sums were astounding. Millions of money were transferred into accounts with. Lacking a defined goal, Sarah whispered to herself, "This isn't over." Hardening, she realized that something far greater than she had expected was about to happen. Daniel sat. His thoughts reenacted the events leading up to Whitmore's death as he stared at the barren walls of his prison cell. As he felt the physical force of his guilt bearing down on him, he remembered Toby, the devoted dog who had been the key to his demise, and he experienced regret for the first time. Although wouldn't alter his destiny, Daniel was aware that he had forfeited all of his freedom, his reputation, and his opportunity to make atonement. The air in Sarah's office was heavy, and all that was left was the harsh, unforgiving reality of the decisions he had made. As she eagerly went over the information that the anonymous source had given, she saw indications of a murky network. Whitmore's business, which had been conducting business covertly for years, had offshore transactions, concealed bank accounts, and, while at the rehabilitation facility, coded signals revealed a picture of corruption that extended much beyond Daniel's acts. Senator Toby was agitated, as though he felt the story wasn't finished yet, was still incorrect, and Sarah, who had come late to see him, sat next to him. She remarked, scratching, "You always know when there's more to uncover," as her laptop perched on her knees in his enclosure. Toby softly barked behind his ears, his brightly intelligent eyes shining. After receiving an anonymous tip, Sarah had spent the last 48 hours piecing together the new evidence. A top executive at Whitmore's company, Langston, is named Robert Langston, had collaborated with Whitmore for many years. But the records revealed that he had been planning a plan to steal money, accuse Whitmore of financial malpractice, and manipulate the strings, Sarah whispered. The next day, Sarah placed a halt to the game, where Daniel was simply another pawn staring at Langston's name on the screen. The stakes were higher than ever when Emily and the sheriff met, and we had enough evidence to accuse Langston. Outlined, laying out the documents on the table. But we must act fast since he will vanish if he discovers this. We'll forfeit our opportunity to prosecute him. The sheriff coldly nodded. Require a team and a warrant to bring him in. But we must also ensure that the press isn't informed until we have. Despite her nervousness, Emily was resolute when he was in jail. What can I do to assist? Prepare. Sarah testified about your father's relationship with Whitmore and your part in bringing Daniel's crime to light. Make you a crucial witness. Langston's attorneys will attempt to undermine us, but your evidence will make it more difficult for. That night, the team rallied the sheriff and his officers to help them escape. Obtained the warrant as Sarah and Emily got ready to present the evidence when they arrived at. Tension was evident at Langston's expansive house on the outskirts of town, and the operation was quick and effective. Police officers encircled the property to make sure Langston, who had been having a. As the cops arrived, he appeared surprised and ordered his evening drink on his terrace. What does this mean? Robert Langston, you are being arrested for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Your voice is brimming with outrage. Sheriff declared in an adamant tone that you have a right to silence. When the officers led Langston to a VI's car that was waiting for Sarah, his protests were ignored. It was as Langston was taken into consideration. It served as both a triumphant moment and a reminder of the extent people would go to in order to gain power and profit. In order to complete the case, Sarah and Emily went back to the station. The evidence against Langston was overpowering, and the full extent of Whitmore's company's malfeasance started to surface after his incarceration. It became evident that Langston had used Daniel's ambitions and fears as leverage to convert him into. Sarah's voice was colored with wrath as she spoke against Whitmore, who he played against everyone. He lined his own pockets with Emily because Whitmore trusted him. Her attitude was solemn as she nodded. But at least we now know the truth and can create. Toby seems to be the only one at the rehabilitation facility who suffers due of him. To feel the change in the atmosphere. And when Sarah came to see him the following morning, he welcomed her with excited barks and kneeling to meet his gaze, wagging tail, and explaining how he did it to Sarah. Thanks to you, Gaze Whitmore's legacy is secure, and their relationship has only been stronger. Throughout the case, Toby's steadfast devotion and astute intuition had served as the foundation for their triumph. And in the weeks that followed Whitmore Daniel's story, Sarah found it impossible to envision her life without him. and Langston garnered widespread media notice, with Sarah, Emily, and the sheriff for their commitment to finding the truth, but Toby became, as the case's emblematic figure. Many were moved by German Shepherd's courage and intelligence, and he was hailed as a hero by Emily. With greater self-assurance and resolve than before, she chose to carry on her father's job, and with Sarah's assistance, she started an endeavor to uphold Whitmore's vision, which emphasizes moral business conduct and community support. As for Sarah, she discovered that she kept returning to the rehab facility because Toby had become into more than simply a. He had entered her life as a member of the case one lovely afternoon when they, playing in the center's yard, she decided to say, "I see, Toby." Warmth-filled. "Would you want to accompany me home?" Toby shouted with excitement, his tail bouncing wildly, as though, at the end of the case, he knew exactly what she meant when she said, "Sarah." As she watched Toby chase a ball in her backyard, she thought back on all of their experiences together, including the betrayal, lost the fight for justice, which had all culminated in this point, and although the path had been challenging, she occasionally believed it was worth it. The most surprising connections that eternally alter our life. Sarah was sitting on her porch as the sun was sinking over the town. The sweet singing of birds and the delicate rustle of leaves filled the stark air as Toby lay happily at her feet. For the first time, in contrast to the overwhelming chaos that had dominated their life in the previous weeks, it seemed, Whitmore's business, which had previously been corrupted, was permanently at peace. Emily had worked relentlessly to honor her, and now it was in her hands along with a recently selected group of moral leaders. Father's legacy, guaranteeing that the business would remain a representation of honesty and community service. One of her first projects was to establish a scholarship foundation in Whitmore's honor to aid impoverished children. Emily stood at the podium during the scholarship money launch event, her voice steady yet full of. She stated that my father believed in raising people up and that he also believed in second chances. Others by providing them with the resources they need to thrive. This fund is how we carry. The audience exploded in applause, their admiration for him clear, while he focused on his mission and making sure his vision endured. Sarah was one among them, proudly observing, knowing how much this moment meant to Emily and feeling thankful to have helped make it feasible for Toby to return to the rehabilitation facility where he was. But even though everyone knew there was only one person, the hospital had formally certified him ready for adoption, who could actually provide him with the house he deserved. Sarah, who had become inseparable from Toby, didn't take long to make the decision. Friends and co-workers gathered to welcome Toby home on the day of his adoption, which was a celebration in and of itself. Giving him toys and snacks, Sarah added, "You've earned this, buddy." Sarah knelt down to give him a hug, and Toby waggled his tail. As the weeks stretched into months, Sarah and Toby adapted to a new life, his eyes glimmering with joy. Routine. They spent their days taking walks in the park, spending pleasant evenings on the porch, and occasionally visiting the rehab facility to see old friends. Toby had emerged as a hero in the community, and Sarah was frequently approached by kids on the street to pat him and listen to his tale. One cool fall morning, Sarah got in. The mail had an unexpected letter with an animal rights organization's emblem on it, and an offer to present at a forthcoming conference on the theme was enclosed. Enduring ties the function of animals and justice, and healing. Sarah paused at. Initially, she wasn't very good at public speaking, but when she glanced down at Toby, who was looking up at her with his customary blend of devotion and interest, which she knew she couldn't ignore. They had the chance to inspire others at the conference by sharing their tale. Was attended by activists and law enforcement authorities in a large auditorium, with supporters of animals from all across the world. When Sarah took the stage, the audience cheered and applauded as she trotted behind her. Sarah took a deep breath before starting. "This is," she said, "he's not just a dog. He's a hero together," in a steady yet kind voice. "We discovered the truth about a horrible crime, and as a result, we developed a relationship that permanently altered our lives." Discussed Whitmore's situation, the difficulties they encountered, and the insights they discovered. She highlighted the significance of acknowledging animals as sentient entities with exceptional bravery and commitment. Toby didn't just assist us resolve a case. Sarah came to the conclusion that he reminded us of the strength of love and trust. Her tenacity, the audience applauded her with a standing ovation. After the discussion, it was evident that many individuals came up to Sarah to express their gratitude and share their personal tales of animal friendship. It served as a reminder that even though Sarah and Toby traveled home that night, demonstrating that even in the darkest moments, there is light. After the case, the trial, and the revelations, she felt a sense of fulfillment that she hadn't had in years. Worth it, but above all, she was appreciative of Toby's steadfast. Back at home, Sarah put a new nameplate on Toby's collar because loyalty had been the cornerstone of their journey. As she put it around Toby's neck, she grinned and read Toby the devoted hero. Oh, in the days when she said, "That's who you are," Toby waggled his tail and leaned in her touch, rubbing behind his ears. After life settled back into its regular rhythm, Sarah carried on with her investigative work. But this time, she had a fresh perspective. Of purpose, she and her family stayed close and frequently worked together on community projects that were motivated by Whitmore's vision. Toby, Sarah's faithful friend, was always by her side, whether they were investigating a case, going to the park, or he always served as a reminder of their shared adventure and their friendship, even when they were just having a peaceful evening at home. That had united them as Whitmore of Danieli's, and Toby's narrative vanished from the news reports it left behind. People all around the nation were motivated by the story of a devoted German shepherd who had left a legacy of hope and perseverance, assisted in revealing the truth and providing Sarah's bereaved family with justice. Finding what she didn't know she was lacking in Toby was the journey's main goal, not merely cracking a case. She had discovered a friend, a guardian, and a reliable source in addition to a partner. Of joy, Sarah reflected on everything they had while sitting on her porch one evening and watching the sunset with Toby at her feet. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" she murmured quietly to Toby, waving his tail in accord. He seemed to be saying, "Did you enjoy this?" "Tail, do you think that loyalty and the connection between people and animals are powerful?" Please share your comments in the for more touching tales like this one. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel in the comment section below. We appreciate your time and hope to see you in the next video.